Princess Charlotte gave a secret signal to the royal guard. So he instantly broke protocol. 2 men closed in on Princess Charlotte in broad daylight. Hidden blades practiced movements only seconds from the gate. At 10 years old, she knew screaming wouldn't save her. Not with hundreds of tourists around and the band's drums drowning out every sound. So, she did something else. Something every child is taught in school, but prays never to use. She raised her hand and gave the silent signal that means just one thing. Help me. Guardsman Edward Hale saw it. And in that instant, 3 centuries of unbroken protocol meant nothing compared to a child's plea. But how did a single hand gesture force a royal guard to abandon his post? And what happened when those kidnappers realized their perfect plan had just been shattered by a girl who refused to be a victim? Before we show you exactly what unfolded in those terrifying minutes, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The forecourt of Buckingham Palace breathes differently than anywhere else in London. Even on the busiest afternoons, and the city beyond the black iron gates thrums with double-decker buses and taxi horns, the ancient cobblestones seem to absorb sound rather than echo it. The cream-colored stone catches afternoon sunlight and holds it, bathing everything in the kind of golden glow that makes tourists pause mid-conversation and reach for their cameras without quite knowing why. Today, the light was particularly generous. It pulled around the gilded crests above the main gates, bounced off the polished brass fittings, and made the scarlet tunics of the guards burn like beacons against the pale backdrop. From somewhere beyond the main courtyard, the regimental band was warming up. French horns calling back and forth across the square in deep, resonant notes that seemed to rise from the stones themselves. The barriers were already 3 deep with visitors. Germans with expensive cameras and detailed itineraries. American families clutching guidebooks and checking phones for the perfect angle. A group of Japanese tourists had stationed themselves at the prime viewing spot and weren't budging until the last note of the ceremony faded. Everyone pressed forward with that peculiar mix of excitement and reverence you only see at places where history isn't just remembered, but actively performed. Boot heels struck cobblestones in perfect unison somewhere behind the gates. The sound sharp and purposeful, building towards something magnificent. The tourists leaned forward instinctively, phones rising like offerings to capture whatever was about to emerge from the palace depths. But not everyone was pressed against the public barriers. Off to one side, separated by a length of polished chain and the quiet presence of 2 men in dark suits, a much smaller group occupied what most visitors never even noticed, a reserved section where no tour guides pointed and no cameras intruded without permission. At the center of this protected space stood a girl who looked like she'd walked straight out of a portrait gallery, 10 years old. Her features already showing the sharp clarity that marked her as unmistakably royal. Her pale blue coat was perfectly pressed, her shoes reflected the afternoon light with mirror brightness, and her dark hair was arranged with a kind of precision that suggested serious adult attention to detail. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her, not fidgeting like most children her age might have done, but watching the guards with intense concentration. Her gaze tracked their movements, studied their positioning, analyzed their bearing with the focused attention of someone who understood she was witnessing something important rather than merely entertaining. Princess Charlotte of Wales. The cameras pointed elsewhere out of respect, but everyone who knew how to look recognized her immediately. Guardsman Edward Hale registered her presence without turning his head or shifting his stance. At 31, he was older than many of the soldiers who rotated through ceremonial duties, and his bearing showed it. The bearskin hat that crowned his already tall frame cast his face in shadow. But beneath that shadow lay eyes that missed nothing. Afghanistan had given him those eyes. 2 tours in Helmand province had burned into him the survival habit of watching crowds, measuring distances, reading the subtle signals that separated ordinary behavior from potential threat. Where other people saw tourists admiring pageantry, Hale noticed the man who checked exits instead of taking photos, the woman whose gaze tracked guard movements rather than soaking up the spectacle. His left knee ached faintly where shrapnel had found its mark during his final patrol, the injury that had eventually brought him home and into the scarlet tunic of ceremonial duty. Some of his mates had seen the assignment as a step down from active combat. Hale had understood it differently. The threat environment had changed, not disappeared. Here in the heart of London, vigilance was still survival. Standing motionless for hours was its own kind of endurance test, but Hale had learned to use the stillness productively. His eyes worked constantly beneath the shadow of the bare skin, cataloging faces, tracking patterns, noting the small inconsistencies that might matter when they mattered most. And right now something was setting off every alarm bell his training had installed. Two men stood near the edge of the crowd, close enough to the royal section to matter. From a distance, they looked like any other sightseers. Casual jackets, unremarkable trousers, cameras hanging from their necks like props in a tourist costume, but their eyes weren't following the bright scarlet tunics, or admiring the ceremony's precision. They were working. One scanned the positioning of guards with mechanical thoroughness. The other studied the flow of people toward the gates, his head turning with the calculated precision of someone mapping routes rather than enjoying the view. Between them, something that looked like a tourist pamphlet changed hands, but the way it was folded, the brief flash of handwriting across its surface, suggested it contained information that had nothing to do with London's historic attractions. Hale's grip on his rifle stock tightened almost imperceptibly. The weapon, ceremonial, though it appeared, was fully functional, and his muscle memory knew exactly how quickly it could become something more than ornamental. But protocol kept his boots locked to the ancient stone. Until he had more than suspicion, until he could prove rather than simply sense danger, his duty was to remain exactly where tradition had placed him. The taller of the two men shifted position, moving closer to the chain that separated the public from the royal viewing area. His movement was smooth, casual, the kind of adjustment a tourist might make to get a better photograph. But tourists didn't move with that kind of controlled economy. Tourists didn't keep their elbows tight to their sides to avoid displaying the outline of objects concealed beneath their jackets. Princess Charlotte's governess leaned down to say something to her charge, adjusting the girl's coat against the afternoon breeze. Charlotte nodded politely, her attention still fixed on the guards, her young face serious with concentration. She was learning, Hale realized. This wasn't entertainment for her. It was education in the weight of tradition. The meaning of duty, the price of service. The second man had moved as well, positioning himself on the opposite side of the royal section's perimeter. Now they formed a bracket close enough to the chain barrier to matter, far enough from the obvious security presence to avoid immediate attention. Their timing was careful, their positioning deliberate, and then Hale saw the glint. It lasted only a fraction of a second, sunlight catching steel as the taller man's jacket shifted. A blade small enough to conceal, but large enough to matter, disappeared back beneath the cover of casual clothing. The movement was practiced, professional, the kind of concealment that spoke of experience with weapons and the violence they enabled. Hale's pulse remained steady, but internally he was already calculating angles, distances, response times. His ceremonial stillness had become a combat posture. His awareness sharpened to the crystalline focus that had kept him alive in places where hesitation meant death. The band's warm-up crescendoed into something approaching the opening notes of the ceremony, and the crowd's attention turned fully toward the palace entrance, where the first guards would soon appear. In that moment of distraction, the two men moved with the synchronized precision that confirmed Hale's worst suspicions. This wasn't random. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned. The shorter man approached the governess, bumping into her with the clumsy politeness of a tourist trying to navigate a crowded space. She turned, frowning as he offered elaborate apologies for his carelessness. The interaction looked innocent enough until Hale noticed that it positioned her with her back to Princess Charlotte, blocking her view of what was happening behind her. The taller man closed the distance to Charlotte in 3 measured steps. His jacket brushed against her side as he bent low, his voice too quiet for anyone else to hear, but clearly audible to the girl whose eyes suddenly went wide with alarm. From Hale's position, he could see the unnatural closeness, the controlled tension in the man's posture, the way his hidden hand maintained pressure against Charlotte's ribs. The knife. It had to be pressed against her side, invisible to the crowd, impossible to ignore. Charlotte stiffened, her natural poise cracking just enough to reveal the frightened child beneath the royal composure. The man's false smile was aimed at the nearest camera, creating the illusion of a helpful adult guiding a young relative through the crowd. But his words, lost in the growing swell of music and crowd noise, carried the unmistakable cadence of threat. The second man moved into position on Charlotte's other side, completing the trap. To anyone watching casually, it looked like two attentive relatives shepherding a royal child through the forecourt. Only the unnatural stiffness in Charlotte's shoulders, and the predatory focus in the men's eyes betrayed the truth. Hale felt every muscle in his body coil with the need to move, to act, to cross the distance between his post and the developing crisis. But 3 centuries of tradition held him in place like iron chains. Guards did not break formation. Guards did not abandon their posts. Guards maintained their positions regardless of circumstance because the moment that discipline cracked, the entire foundation of ceremonial duty crumbled. But what happened when ceremonial duty conflicted with something more fundamental? What happened when tradition demanded stillness while conscience demanded action? Charlotte's governess turned back from her conversation with the shorter man, her expression shifting from polite confusion to the first stirrings of alarm as she registered the changed configuration around her young charge. She called softly, "Charlotte!" But her voice was swallowed by the growing noise of the ceremony. The taller man offered her a bland smile and gestured toward the gate, saying something about finding a quieter spot for the child to watch from. His accent was educated, his manner disarming, his explanation perfectly reasonable, and in the moment of his governess' hesitation, he guided Charlotte forward with the inexorable pressure of the blade against her side. They were moving toward the gate now. Each step measured and deliberate, never fast enough to draw attention, but purposeful enough to cover ground. Beyond the iron railings, Hale caught a glimpse of a dark vehicle idling where it shouldn't be. Engine running, driver ready. Charlotte understood what was happening. Despite her youth, despite the careful protection that had surrounded her since birth, she recognized the reality of her situation with the clarity that sometimes comes to children in moments of genuine crisis. She was being taken. The knife against her ribs made resistance impossible. Screaming would only ensure that the blade found its mark before help could arrive. But she had been taught other options. In a world where royal children needed to understand threats that ordinary families never considered, she had learned signals that could convey danger when words were impossible. As they drew level with Hale's position, Charlotte's pace slowed almost imperceptibly. The man beside her muttered something sharp, his grip tightening, but she managed to turn her head just enough to catch the guardsman's eye. Her hand rose smoothly, naturally, as if she was simply brushing hair from her face. But the movement continued with deliberate precision that transformed a casual gesture into something else entirely. Palm open, thumb tucked, fingers folding over. The universal signal. The one taught to children across the country. The one that meant, "I am in danger and I cannot speak." Hale saw it. Recognition hit him like a physical blow, stopping his breath for a heartbeat before training reasserted itself. The signal was unmistakable, deliberate, desperate. Princess Charlotte of Wales was asking for help in the only way she could. Time compressed into a single moment of choice. On one side lay 3 centuries of unbroken tradition, the weight of protocol, the absolute discipline that defined his service. On the other side stood a 10-year-old girl with a knife pressed to her ribs and seconds left before she disappeared forever into the London streets. Edward Hale, guardsman of Her Majesty's Guard, made his decision. The crack of boots against ancient cobblestone split the afternoon air like a gunshot. Every head in the forecourt turned at once. Cameras swung toward the sound. Tourists gasped in confusion. And even the regimental band faltered for a half-beat before recovering their rhythm. In 362 years of ceremonial duty, no guardsman had ever broken formation. Not once, not for any reason. Until now. Hale moved with the fluid economy of a soldier whose body had been trained to respond before his mind finished processing commands. His scarlet tunic blazed against the pale stone as he closed the distance to the kidnappers, rifle angled with professional precision. The bearskin hat that had shadowed his face now seemed to crown him with authority rather than conceal him in ceremony. His voice carried across the courtyard with the weight of absolute command. "Release her now." The taller man froze mid-stride, his false smile dissolving into something harder and more dangerous. His grip on Charlotte shifted, and Hale caught the telltale adjustment that meant the hidden blade was being repositioned for maximum effect. "Keep walking," the man hissed under his breath to Charlotte. But the girl had stopped moving entirely, her trust placed in the soldier who had answered her signal. The crowd pressed back from the barriers, sensing violence approaching, but not yet understanding its shape. Phones rose higher, capturing shaky footage of something unprecedented unfolding in the heart of Royal London. Hale's second step brought him within striking distance. His third put him close enough to see the whites of the kidnapper's eyes, close enough to smell the nervous sweat beneath expensive cologne, close enough to act. The man's mask finally slipped completely. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," he snarled, abandoning all pretense of tourist politeness. "Walk away now, or she pays the price." Hale's response was immediate and devastating. His left hand shot forward with surgical precision, clamping over the man's wrist with enough force to feel bones grinding together. A sharp twist. The exact movement drilled into him during countless hours of close-quarters combat training, and the concealed knife clattered to the cobblestones with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden hush. Charlotte stumbled backward as Hale pulled her behind his body, shielding her with his broad frame, while his right hand maintained perfect control of his rifle. The weapon that had been ceremonial seconds before was now positioned with the professional competence of someone who understood exactly how to use it. The second kidnapper, seeing his partner disarmed, abandoned subtlety entirely. He lunged forward with desperate fury, hands clawing toward Charlotte, but Hale was already moving. The butt of his rifle swept upward in a brutal arc, catching the man squarely in the chest with enough force to fold him in half. The attacker recovered faster than expected, training of his own evident in the way he rolled with the impact and came back swinging. His fist caught Hale's jaw, snapping his head to the side. But the guardsman's response was immediate and overwhelming. Years of combat experience compressed into a series of devastating strikes that left both kidnappers on the ground, gasping, finished. Screams erupted from the watching crowd. Children cried out in fear. Adults stumbled backward, and the orderly ceremony dissolved into chaos. But through it all, Hale stood over Charlotte like a scarlet fortress, ensuring that no further threat could reach her. Palace security materialized from hidden positions, their own weapons drawn, voices barking orders that cut through the confusion. Within seconds, both attackers were face down on the ancient stones, hands cuffed behind their backs, their carefully laid plans shattered by one soldier's decision to act when action was needed. In the sudden quiet that followed, Charlotte looked up at Hale with eyes that held no fear, only gratitude. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady despite everything she had just endured. "You saw me." Hale inclined his head slightly, his formal bearing intact, despite the blood trickling from his split lip. "You gave the signal, Your Highness." Any guardsman would have done the same. But they both knew that wasn't true. Only one guardsman had been watching carefully enough to see. Only one had been willing to break centuries of tradition when tradition conflicted with duty to something higher. The aftermath unfolded with a controlled efficiency that suggested extensive experience in managing crises that weren't supposed to happen. Additional security personnel flooded the forecourt, establishing a secure perimeter while plainclothes officers searched the attacker's belongings. A smartphone fell from the taller man's jacket during the process. Its screen revealing detailed maps of palace grounds, timed schedules of ceremonies, and photographs taken from multiple angles over several days of surveillance. "This was planned," one of the investigators muttered, scrolling through messages that referenced extraction windows and minimum response times. "They've been watching for weeks." As the prisoners were dragged away, still dazed from Hale's precise violence, the crowd began to understand what they had witnessed. A 10-year-old princess had nearly been kidnapped in broad daylight in front of hundreds of witnesses at one of the most secure locations in Britain, and she had been saved by a guardsman who chose duty to humanity over duty to protocol. The heavy oak doors of Buckingham Palace closed behind them with the finality of a vault ceiling. The sudden quiet felt almost unnatural after the chaos of the forecourt, where tourists were still buzzing with excitement and confusion, while security teams worked to restore some semblance of normal ceremony. Hale stood at attention in a wood-paneled corridor that smelled of centuries of serious conversations. His scarlet tunic was disheveled, his bare skin tucked under his arm, a thin line of blood dried at the corner of his mouth, where the kidnapper's fist had connected. But his bearing remained rigid, professional, ready for whatever consequences his unprecedented action had earned. Major Christopher Harwood waited with the kind of expression that gave nothing away. Beside him stood a plain-clothed security officer whose notebook had been getting a workout over the past 30 minutes. "Guardsman Hale," Harwood began, his tone neutral. "You understand why you're here?" "Yes, sir. To account for breaking formation during ceremonial duty." The security officer cleared his throat. "Before we address the protocol violation, walk us through what you observed." Hale's recounting was precise, methodical, stripped of emotion. The suspicious behavior that had first caught his attention, the coordinated positioning that suggested professional training, the glimpse of the concealed weapon, and finally the moment that had transformed suspicion into certainty. "Her Royal Highness made the universal distress signal," he concluded, palm open, thumb tucked, fingers folding over. "She made it deliberately, looking directly at me. The meaning was unmistakable." Harwood exchanged a glance with the security officer. "And that signal justified abandoning your post, sir." With respect, that signal meant a member of the royal family was in immediate danger. "And requesting assistance. No protocol supersedes the duty to protect." The corridor fell silent except for the distant ticking of an ancient clock. Finally, footsteps approached from the far end, light measured, accompanied by the rustle of adults walking carefully around someone much smaller. Princess Charlotte appeared, flanked by her governess and 2 protection officers. She walked with the same composure she had shown during the ceremony, but now there was something else in her bearing, a gravity that seemed older than her 10 years. "Your Highness," Harwood said, straightening. "You don't need to." "Duh." "Yes I do," Charlotte interrupted politely, but firmly. "He did what I asked him to do." She stepped forward until she was standing directly in front of Hale, her chin tilted up to meet his gaze. "I made the signal," she said clearly, "just like they taught us in school. When you can't speak, but you need help, you make this sign." She demonstrated the gesture with precise execution. He saw it. He came. The security officer closed his notebook with a soft snap. "That settles the question of authorization." Harwood nodded slowly. "The protocol breach remains unprecedented. But the circumstances," he paused, studying Hale with something that might have been respect. "The circumstances were also unprecedented." Charlotte looked between the adults with the patience of someone accustomed to watching grown-ups work through complicated decisions. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of gentle authority that reminded everyone present exactly who she was. "He listened when I couldn't speak. That's what guards are supposed to do, isn't it? Protect people." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Harwood cleared his throat. "Your Highness is quite correct. Protection is our primary duty." "Then he did his duty," Charlotte said simply. The Major turned back to Hale. "There will be inquiries, review boards, questions in Parliament about discipline and precedent." His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "But you acted to protect a member of the royal family based on her direct request for assistance. The regiment stands behind that decision." For the first time since entering the palace, Hale allowed himself to relax slightly. "Thank you, sir." Charlotte stepped closer, her small hand reaching into her coat pocket. "I made something for you," she said, producing a folded piece of paper. While they were asking me questions, Hale accepted the paper and opened it carefully. Inside was a drawing executed in colored pencil with the precise attention to detail that marked it as clearly her work. It showed a guardsman in a bear ski-knee hat standing protectively in front of a small figure in a blue coat. At the bottom in careful handwriting were the words, "Thank you for seeing my signal." The guardsman, who had faced down armed kidnappers without flinching, felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Your Highness, you listened," she said simply. "That's what mattered." As Charlotte was escorted away, she looked back once more. Her small wave was answered by Hale's precise salute, a moment of connection that spoke to something deeper than protocol or ceremony. Later, as evening settled over London, Hale returned to his quarters in Wellington Barracks. Word of the day's events had travelled quickly through the regiment. Brother guardsmen, who had maintained their own rigid positions throughout the crisis, nodded their approval as he passed. Officers, who had spent careers upholding tradition, offered quiet words of support for his decision to break it when it mattered most. In his small room, Hale carefully pinned Charlotte's drawing to the wall beside his bed. The childish artwork joined commendations from Afghanistan, photographs of fallen comrades, and other reminders of why men chose to serve in the first place. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister in Manchester. Saw the news. Dad would have been proud. Their father had been a guardsman, too, 40 years earlier. He'd served through different threats, different crises, but the same fundamental duty to stand between danger and those who needed protection. Hale wondered what the old man would have made of today's choice, between tradition and action, protocol and protection. The answer came clearly. His father would have understood that some duties transcended uniform and ceremony. Some moments required a man to step out from behind the pageantry and remember what the scarlet tunic really represented. A week later, Princess Charlotte attended another ceremony at Buckingham Palace. This time she stood in the royal section with quiet confidence, watching the guards with the same focused attention, but without the hidden fear that had marked her previous visit. Hale was there too, back at his ceremonial post, rifle angled precisely, bare skin casting his face in shadow. To the tourists pressed against the barriers, he looked exactly like what they expected. An immovable monument to tradition and discipline, but Charlotte knew better. When their eyes met briefly across the forecourt, she touched her chest once just over her heart. A small gesture that carried enormous meaning. The signal between them now wasn't distress, but recognition, understanding, shared knowledge, that sometimes the greatest service came not from following rules, but from knowing when to break them. Hale's response was almost invisible, the slightest inclination of his head, a moment of acknowledgement that lasted no longer than a heartbeat. Then he resumed his perfect stillness, the guardian of tradition who had proved that tradition's highest purpose was protecting those who could not protect themselves. The ceremony continued with its timeless precision. Bands played music that had echoed off these walls for centuries. Guards moved through formations perfected over generations. Tourists captured moments of pageantry that would fill photo albums and social media feeds around the world. But everyone present understood they were witnessing something more than performance. They were seeing the continuation of something living, something that still mattered, something worth protecting, even when protection required breaking every rule in the book. And in the reserved royal section, a 10-year-old girl watched with the knowledge that she had learned something invaluable about courage, duty, and the quiet heroes who stand ready to act when action is needed most. What would you have done if you'd seen that distress signal? Would you have recognized it for what it was, a child's silent cry for help? And do you think Guardsman Hale was right to break 3 centuries of protocol the moment Princess Charlotte raised her hand? Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a 10-year-old girl making a secret signal when she can't speak. Sometimes it's a soldier choosing duty to humanity over duty to tradition. If this story moved you, hit that like button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our daily uploads. Share this with someone who needs to remember that the right choice isn't always the easy choice and that real heroes are the ones who act when everyone else is watching. Your next Royal Guard story is waiting right there on your screen. Click it now, and I'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth.